Imagine opening your eyes one ordinary morning and realizing that everything you have ever struggled with, the weakness in your body, the breath that never quite comes easily, the fog that clouds your thoughts, can be traced back to one unbearable truth, a truth you never chose. You come to understand that the shaking of your hands, the pain in your bones, the confusion in your mind, all originate from decisions made long before you existed. Choices imposed on you by ancestors who valued bloodlines over lives. You learn that your family history is not a tree at all, but a knot. Your mother is also your cousin. Your father is your uncle. Your grandmother is at once your great aunt. There are no branches, only loops tightening inward. You were not born from love or chance, but from a deliberate strategy, a breeding system meant to protect power, titles, and wealth, regardless of the cost to the children it produced. This is not a nightmare or a work of fiction. It was reality for countless women across European history. Women who entered the world already condemned by genetics they did not choose, trapped in dynasties where marriage was politics and childbirth was obligation. Their lives became experiments in suffering, their bodies evidence of a belief system that placed lineage above humanity. To understand what happened to these women, we must first understand the logic that created them. For centuries, European royalty convinced themselves that their right to rule was divine. Their blood, they believed, was purer than that of ordinary people, blessed, elevated, and separate. To mix it with outsiders was unthinkable. Marriage within the family was not seen as dangerous, but as necessary. By the 16th century, European royal families across Europe had become one vast interlinked network of relatives. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. Genetic diversity vanished generation by generation, replaced by repetition and decay. What they failed to understand, what science had yet not revealed, was that they were building a biological catastrophe that would echo for centuries. No family embodied this tragedy more completely than the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain. Their political strategy relied on marriage rather than warfare, but these unions came at a terrible cost. Each generation inherited not only crowns and titles, but a growing burden of deformities, illness, infertility, and mental suffering. Their legacy was written not just in treaties and borders, but in damaged bodies and shortened lives. One such life began in Vienna in 1634, within the cold, shadowed halls of the imperial palace. A girl named Maria Anna was born into privilege and into pain. From her first breath, the consequences of generations of intermarriage were already embedded in her body. She was not an exception, but a continuation, another link in a chain of genetic collapse. From early childhood, Maria Anna knew she was different. While other children ran freely, she struggled to stand. Her spine curved unnaturally, forcing her body into a posture that made even breathing a challenge. Her jaw protruded so severely that eating became an exhausting ritual. Meals were slow, careful, and often painful. Servants cut her food into tiny pieces, yet even then she labored to swallow. But physical suffering was only part of her burden. As she grew older, she began to understand why her body betrayed her. The palace walls were lined with portraits of her ancestors, and in those painted faces she saw herself reflected again and again. The same jaw, the same posture, the same hollow eyes. She realized with devastating clarity that her pain was inherited, not a random cruelty, but but the predictable outcome of her family's choices. Doctors examined her regularly, measuring her deformities with cold precision. They recorded symptoms, offered prayers, prescribed bloodletting and rituals, yet provided no relief. Among themselves, they whispered of a family curse, but never spoke the truth aloud. To Maria Anna, they spoke of God's will and mysterious ailments, never acknowledging what everyone understood but refused to confront. Her suffering was man-made. Confined to dim rooms with heavy curtains, Maria Anna retreated into books. Her mind remained sharp even as her body failed her. Through reading, she discovered worlds where birth did not dictate destiny, where love mattered more than lineage. Yet reality always returned. She was observed, documented, and discussed not as a person, but as evidence. Loneliness became her constant companion. Suitors, all of them relatives, quickly lost interest once her condition became known. Negotiations ended quietly. Even in a society accustomed to marrying kin, her visible damage could not be ignored. She remained unmarried, not by choice, but by rejection. Maria Anna died at 32. Her body, weakened by lifelong genetic damage, finally gave way. Official records listed various illnesses, but none named the true cause. She died because generation after generation had chosen power over compassion, tradition over humanity. Her story was not unique. It was only the beginning.
From Austria, the story shifts south to Spain, where another woman's life became one of the clearest symbols of dynastic cruelty. History remembers her as Joanna of Castile, forever burdened with the name the Mad. Yet madness was not what defined her life. Confinement was. Joanna was born in 1479 to parents who embodied the same fatal logic that plagued Europe's ruling houses. They were close relatives, bound together by politics and blood. As a child, Joanna showed no signs of instability. She was intelligent, deeply educated, and fluent in several languages. She possessed a sharp, curious mind and an emotional depth that set her apart from the rigid expectations of court life. Nothing about her early years suggested the fate that awaited her. The seeds of her destruction were invisible, but already present. Her genetics carried generations of accumulated risk, vulnerabilities that would later be pushed to their limits by isolation, betrayal, and loss. Those pressures arrived with her marriage. Joanna was wed to Philip of Burgundy in a political arrangement designed to strengthen alliances. The match had nothing to do with affection. Philip was distant, unfaithful, and manipulative, while Joanna, raised to believe that marriage was her highest duty, invested her entire sense of worth in the relationship. Her devotion became intense, even desperate, and observers quickly labeled her behavior irrational. What they failed to ask was whether her reactions were abnormal or simply human responses to emotional abandonment. Her world collapsed completely when Philip died suddenly in 1506. Grief overtook her in a way that shocked the court. She refused to part from his body, traveling with his coffin across Spain and demanding that it be opened repeatedly. The image horrified contemporaries, but beneath the spectacle was a woman stripped of every source of stability. Her attachment to Philip, however flawed, had been the center of her emotional life. When he was gone, nothing remained. Rather than offering compassion, her family seized opportunity. Her father, and later her son, declared her unfit to rule. Her grief was reframed as insanity, and that diagnosis became a political weapon. Joanna was confined to a religious complex where she would remain for nearly half a century. Her imprisonment was brutal. She lived in dark, cold rooms, denied basic comforts and hygiene. Food was scarce. She was isolated from meaningful human contact. Reports from attendants described her screaming for hours, tearing at her clothes, refusing to eat, and sinking into long periods of despair. Yet modern historians increasingly question whether her condition was ever true psychosis. What she exhibited aligns closely with severe depression, anxiety, and trauma, all intensified by long-term confinement and abuse. Genetics cannot be ignored here. Joanna's family history reveals repeated patterns of emotional instability, melancholy, and mental illness, conditions that grow more severe when inbreeding concentrates vulnerability. Her suffering was not solely political, nor solely biological. It was the collision of both. Joanna died in 1555, still imprisoned, still officially declared mad. By then, she had been erased from public life for decades. Her story survived only as a cautionary tale, stripped of nuance and empathy. She was remembered not as a queen denied her throne, but as a problem conveniently removed. The pattern repeated itself in the next generation. In 1651, another child was born into the Spanish court, a fragile girl named Margaret Teresa. Her father was the King of Spain. Her mother was his niece. By this point, such unions had become routine within the ruling family. No one questioned them. No one intervened. Margaret Teresa's childhood was preserved in stunning detail through royal portraits. On canvas, she appears richly dressed, surrounded by symbols of wealth and power. But behind the silk and ceremony, her body told a different story. Even as a child, the signs were there. A subtly protruding jaw, a stiff posture, an expression that seemed distant, unfocused. Her development lagged behind other children. Her health was fragile. Yet the most tragic aspect of her life was not illness, but inevitability. From the moment she was born, her future was decided. She was promised in marriage to her uncle while still a toddler. The arrangement was celebrated across Europe as a diplomatic triumph. No one paused to consider the child at the center of it. Margaret Teresa grew up knowing her sole purpose was to continue the dynasty. She received an exceptional education, learning languages, music, and art. But none of it was for her fulfillment. Every skill was meant to make her a more suitable bride for the man she was destined to marry. That marriage took place when she was just 15. Her husband was not only her uncle, but a man old enough to be her father. The wedding was lavish, the celebrations grand. For Margaret Teresa, it marked the end of childhood and the beginning of relentless pressure. She was expected to bear children immediately, despite her youth and poor health. Pregnancy followed pregnancy, each one draining what little strength she had. Some children died shortly after birth, others never survived the womb. When a son finally lived past infancy, relief swept through the court, until it became clear that he too carried the same genetic burden. With every passing year, Margaret Teresa weakened. She suffered from respiratory problems, extreme fatigue, and episodes that modern doctors would likely identify as seizures. Physicians carefully recorded her decline, never daring to acknowledge the cause that stared them in the face. She died at 21. Her death was mourned not for the life lost, but for the dynastic potential extinguished. Once again, a woman's worth was measured not in years lived, but in heirs produced. And once again, the system continued, unquestioned, unbroken, and hungry for the next sacrifice.
From Spain, the story moves north to France, to the glittering court of Versailles, a place of ceremony, splendor, and carefully hidden suffering. Here lived a woman known to history as Anne of Austria, a Spanish princess whose life revealed yet another cost of dynastic obsession. Anne was born at the turn of the 17th century into a family already marked by generations of intermarriage. Her parents were close relatives, as were most of their ancestors. From early childhood, Anne showed signs of the familiar pattern. She developed slowly, struggled with learning, and exhibited physical traits that had become synonymous with her family's bloodline. Her lower jaw protruded noticeably, making speech awkward and eating difficult. Even more troubling were her emotional struggles.
She experienced persistent anxiety, deep sadness, and periods of withdrawal that would today be recognized as serious mental health conditions. At 14, Anne was sent to France and married to King Louis XIII as part of a political effort to secure peace between rival powers. She was still a child, torn from her home, and placed in an unfamiliar court where she was expected to perform flawlessly. The celebrations that welcomed her masked a colder reality. Her husband was distant and emotionally unavailable, struggling with his own psychological conflicts. Their marriage quickly became a union in name only. Anne's role as queen came with one unyielding expectation: she was to produce a male heir. Yet pregnancy proved elusive. When it did occur, it often ended in miscarriage or infant death. Each failure intensified scrutiny and blame. Court physicians subjected her to invasive examinations and harsh treatments, bloodletting, purging, extreme diets, all based on the belief that the fault lay in her body alone. No one considered that generations of inbreeding might have made healthy reproduction difficult or dangerous. As the years passed without a surviving child, Anne's isolation deepened. Rumors spread through the court. Some whispered that she was cursed, others claimed divine displeasure. Political factions questioned her value as queen. Under relentless pressure, Anne began to withdraw from public life, retreating into her private chambers. She turned increasingly to religion, seeking comfort in ritual when human support failed her. After more than 20 years of marriage, a miracle finally occurred. Anne gave birth to a healthy son, the future ruler of France. The nation celebrated the event as proof of divine favor. For Anne, the joy was inseparable from fear. She understood that her worth had been restored only because she had succeeded once. The pressure did not disappear until a second son was born, securing the succession at last. Yet the years of emotional strain left lasting damage. Anne never recovered. She continued to suffer from anxiety, bouts of depression, and chronic physical illness. Her later life was marked by digestive problems, breathing difficulties, and recurring episodes of despair that confined her to bed for days at a time. Modern analysis suggests that her symptoms were not random, but part of the same hereditary pattern that haunted her family. Her story might have ended there, but the cycle did not stop.
To grasp the full scale of this tragedy, we must look beyond individual queens and princesses and examine entire generations shaped and destroyed by dynastic isolation. Nowhere was this more visible than among the Spanish royal daughters of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the children of a dynasty already collapsing under its own genetic weight. At the center of this disaster stood a king whose body embodied the consequences of centuries of intermarriage. He was frail, chronically ill, infertile, and neurologically impaired. His genetic inheritance was so compromised that modern analysis suggests his parents were more closely related than siblings in a typical family tree. Yet, while his suffering was evident, the burden placed on his female relatives was often even greater. These royal daughters, raised within palace walls that had become closer to infirmaries than homes, were expected to do what their bodies were least capable of doing: marry and give birth. Their lives were documented in meticulous detail by court physicians, not out of compassion, but to assess their usefulness in future alliances. One girl, born in the mid-17th century, showed severe developmental delays almost from infancy.
She struggled to speak clearly well into childhood, walked with difficulty, and displayed behaviors that today might be recognized as neurodevelopmental disorders. Despite this, her royal status ensured that she was still considered a viable marriage candidate. Her health was secondary to her bloodline. Her sister exhibited a different constellation of symptoms, but suffered no less. She endured frequent seizures, constant respiratory distress, and extreme skeletal deformities. Her jaw was so malformed that she could not chew solid food. Her spine curved to such a degree that she required physical support simply to sit upright. Daily life was a struggle against pain and exhaustion. The palace where these girls grew up was filled with doctors, surgeons, and clergy, moving constantly from room to room. Each child presented a different manifestation of the same underlying problem: epilepsy, immune failure, physical deformities, cognitive impairment, psychological instability. The symptoms varied, but the cause was the same. Yet even in these conditions, negotiations for marriage continued. Medical reports were sent across Europe, detailing each girl's limitations. These documents were not warnings, they were evaluations, meant to determine whether a damaged body could still serve dynastic needs. The language was clinical, detached, and chilling. When marriages occurred, they were often disastrous. Women with developmental delays were expected to understand marital duties they could not comprehend. Those with severe physical deformities were subjected to painful expectations of intimacy and childbirth. The psychological trauma of these unions was immense. Many lived in constant fear of pregnancy, knowing that conception threatened their lives and almost guaranteed suffering for any child born. Letters between royal women from this period reveal heartbreak in its rawest form. They speak of repeated miscarriages, infants who lived only days, and children born so malformed they could not survive outside the womb. Each loss compounded grief with guilt. Without any understanding of genetics, these women blamed themselves. They believed their suffering was punishment, failure, or divine judgment. This self-blame deepened their psychological wounds. Many withdrew from public life, ashamed of bodies they could not control and roles they could not fulfill. Depression and anxiety became constant companions. Some developed profound fear of social exposure, avoiding court appearances altogether. Their world shrunk to a few rooms, a few attendants, and endless cycles of hope and loss. To understand why this devastation was inevitable, we must turn to biology. When closely related individuals reproduce, harmful recessive genes, normally masked in diverse populations, are far more likely to pair. With each generation of repeated intermarriage, these genes accumulate rather than disappear. The result is a phenomenon known today as inbreeding depression. This process does not affect a single trait. It weakens entire systems. Fertility declines. Immune responses falter. Neurological and psychiatric vulnerabilities intensify. Physical deformities become more pronounced. In the Habsburg dynasty, this accumulation reached catastrophic levels. The most visible symbol was the famous jaw deformity that grew more extreme with each generation. Some descendants could not fully close their mouths or chew properly. But beneath these visible signs lay deeper damage: epilepsy, mood disorders, infertility, and immune dysfunction that turned minor illnesses into fatal threats. Mental health suffered profoundly. Anxiety, depression, and emotional instability appeared repeatedly in family records.
These conditions were likely genetic predispositions intensified by relentless stress, isolation, and abuse. Women who might have lived functional lives in healthier circumstances instead collapsed under the combined weight of biology and expectation. What makes this history even more painful is that the warning signs were everywhere. Courts kept detailed health records. Physicians documented patterns that repeated generation after generation. Yet these observations were treated as curiosities rather than alarms. Political advantage always outweighed human cost. Even institutions that might have intervened did not. Religious authorities routinely granted permission for close relative marriages, reinforcing the belief that royal bloodlines were sacred and untouchable. The system protected itself, even as it consumed within it. In some tragic cases, the women themselves upheld the very traditions that destroyed them. Raised to believe in the superiority of their lineage, they sought marriages within the family, unaware that they were continuing a cycle of genetic harm. They did not. The experiment ended when the last king died without heirs, when the bloodline collapsed, leaving behind not triumph, but evidence, written in bodies and lives, of what happens when ideology is valued above humanity. One final part remains: what these women left behind and what their suffering ultimately taught the world.
The collapse of this dynasty marked more than the end of a ruling family. It marked the moment when centuries of suffering finally became impossible to ignore. The death of the last heirless monarch closed a chapter written in illness, infertility, and grief. A chapter that forced Europe to confront a truth it had long refused to see. The women whose lives we have traced were not weak, sinful, or cursed. They were casualties of a system that treated them as vessels rather than people. Their pain was not the result of moral failure or divine punishment, but of human decisions made in pursuit of power. Each generation paid for the choices of the one before it, inheriting damage along with titles. Ironically, their suffering helped advance understanding that would eventually prevent similar tragedies. As science developed, scholars studying royal genealogies began to recognize clear patterns. Traits did not appear randomly. They intensified where families isolated themselves genetically. What had once been labeled bad blood or family curses became understandable through the principles of heredity. Modern genetics now explains what these women lived with without knowing. Recessive disorders, when repeatedly paired through close relative reproduction, emerge with devastating force. Fertility declines, physical deformities worsen, mental health deteriorates. The Habsburg experience became one of the most well-documented examples of this process in human history. Yet scientific value does not redeem human suffering. Knowledge gained from tragedy does not erase the trauma endured by those who lived it. These women were more than data points. They were daughters longing for affection, wives seeking security, mothers grieving lost children. Many of them showed extraordinary resilience within impossible circumstances. Some found refuge in learning, turning inward to preserve a sense of self when their bodies failed them. Others clung to love with fierce intensity, even when it brought pain. Some endured motherhood despite terror and exhaustion. Others faced death with composure when escape was no longer possible. Their strength did not lie in perfection, but in persistence. Their stories also force us to confront a broader truth. The reduction of women to reproductive function did not end with royal courts.
Throughout history and even today, women have been valued primarily for their ability to produce heirs, workers, or successors. The dynastic tragedy is simply its most extreme and visible form. What happened within these palaces serves as a warning. When individuals are stripped of autonomy, when tradition outweighs compassion, and when ideology silences evidence, suffering becomes inevitable. Power blinds institutions to the harm they inflict until collapse makes denial impossible. The legacy of these women is therefore twofold. It is tragic because their suffering was avoidable, but it is also instructive. Their lives helped reveal the importance of genetic diversity, bodily autonomy, and human dignity. Lessons written not in textbooks, but in pain. They remind us that lineage does not determine worth, that nobility is not inherited through blood, but expressed through empathy, that progress begins when human welfare is placed above abstract ideals. In remembering these women, we should not focus on their titles or the thrones they never truly controlled. We should remember them as people, individuals who deserved health, choice, and love, but were denied all three. Their voices, long silenced, still speak through history with a single enduring message. Never again should power be built on the destruction of human lives.